I think we've waited long enough now, so welcome, good morning. Thank you very much for joining today's webinar, where we'll be reacting to last week's budget and thinking about some of the economic challenges and opportunities ahead. This event is being delivered by the K3 Hub and is supported by all the businesses in the K3 Capital Group. My name's James Hurley, I'm Enterprise Editor at the Times newspaper. I'm your chair for this morning's discussion. Thank you to everyone who's joined us, and I hope you'll enjoy and of course get involved with the discussion. On that theme, you'll see a Q&A function just below where the video is. So please do feel free to submit your own real-time questions as the discussion progresses, and I'll try my best to get as many of these as possible to the panelists. I know some of you submitted questions beforehand. Thank you for those, and I'll try my best to feed those into the discussion as well. Before we kick off, I'd also just like to ask you for your patience if we do experience any technical difficulties at any point in the discussion, but fingers crossed that won't be an issue. So let's get started and introduce the panelists. So first of all, we have Jimmy McLoughlin. Jimmy is an experienced political advisor who regularly writes for the Times. Thank you very much, Jimmy. He's worked at Number 10, his time in Downing Street predominantly focusing on business policy, so very relevant for us today. Was also being a special advisor to Prime Ministers Boris Johnson and Theresa May, although I must say he's looking a lot more well-rested these days. And next up we have Burnley's finalist, Carl Jackson, Chief Executive and founder of Quantuma, part of K3 since last year. Carl's a restructuring and insolvency specialist with 30 years experience. He's a dual role as an appointment-taking partner in restructuring, as well as leading the delivery of Quantuma's strategic business plan. I'm also delighted to welcome Kitty Ussher, who shares a Burnley link as former MP for the town. Kitty's Chief Economist for the Institute of Directors. She's a UK macroeconomist and public policy research professional. She also has experience in governments, having worked for the Treasury, Department for Work and Pensions, and the Department for Trade and Industry. Finally, last but certainly not least, we have Cassandra Stavrou, who's the founder of Proper, the UK's biggest independent snack brand. Earlier this year, she partnered with Eats Real to form Europe's largest better-for-you snack company, Warp Snacks. She's also one of the leading voices in Europe for entrepreneurship and sits on the UK government's Food and Drink Sector Council. Cassandra's had a lot of my lunch money over the years, thanks to her delicious popcorn, Proper corn, so I highly recommend that. Now, so let's get started. I think I wanted to start it with just as kind of a step back and into some of the big themes of last week's budget. It always feels like once you've had a few days to process it, you get a better idea. And I think that's certainly the case with Rishi Sunak's budget, because his delivery tends to be so smooth. So you'd have to kind of step back from it for a moment to get a feel for what really happened. I think it was slightly curious to have a budget from a Conservative Chancellor, where we've ended up with the highest tax burden since the 1950s, and public spending at its highest level since the late 1970s. Jimmy, why don't we start off with you? What was your general big picture feeling to last week's budget?
Yeah, well, I think that's right, James. And I think one of the big questions at the moment in the Conservative Party is kind of what is the ideology of the Conservative Party? What does it stand for? You know, we have had this big tax increase budget. I'll tell you what the Conservative Party stands for. It stands for winning. It loves winning more than anything else, and it will do anything to win. And I think that is largely what you saw at this budget in terms of the big picture of it. They view it as a success, largely because you're not writing about it 1 week on, particularly, James. And that is broadly a mid-term budget, which the Conservative Party wanted to do. For business, it was a relatively light budget. More of it was actually written kind of earlier in the year with changes to corporation tax and so on. So I think that is the kind of the big picture of it. But I also think that one of the real challenges that business has got at the moment, and you can broadly see it in the budget as well, is the seismic changes are enormous that we are seeing post the pandemic and so on. Every 30 or 40 years, you get a bigger shift in politics. You know, foundation of the Labour Party in the 1920s, Attlee and coming back from the welfare state in the 1940s and 50s, Margaret Thatcher and the welfare state in the 1970s, 80s. We are at that moment again, and arguably it is even bigger than we've ever seen because of all the kind of technological changes. We're almost seeing a modern day kind of renaissance in the way the economy's changed, migration flows, generation changes. And at the moment, it doesn't really feel like the UK economy or UK business has kind of adapted to that. And I think we'll see bigger and more impactful budgets closer to the election.
Makes sense. Kitty, what about you? What were your sort of big picture reaction to this?
Well, I like Jimmy's analysis. I think probably two main things. First of all, at the time of the budget, we also get the economic forecast, so the official forecast from the Office of Budget Responsibility. And in fact, they were much better in a sense than we'd feared during most of the pandemic. We found out that the economy is pretty much the size it was pre-2020, certainly will be around the turn of the year. Near-term GDP growth, all right, sort of fades a bit towards the end. Unemployment expected to rise a little, but really not the kind of disaster scenario everyone was fearing maybe this time last year for what would happen when furlough ended. So that's a relief. In terms of the policy environment, the way I think about it is that back in the last budget, which was only 6 or 7 months ago in March, we were in the middle of the most enormous amount of pandemic spending, and the Chancellor only really had one job then, which was to tell the financial markets that he had a plan to bring government debt down. And so the only really sort of straightforward way he could do that was to pre-announce this massive rise in corporation tax going up in 2023 from 19 to 25%. Now, 19 was pretty low internationally, so thankfully, which made it kind of possible to do. And that brought the projected debt down. Now, wonderfully, as 2021 continued, it became clear that the economic problem wasn't as bad as everybody feared. And so the economy recovered much faster. And of course, that means more tax receipts now. And this is where it takes us to Jimmy's point, because if he had known that back in March, he wouldn't have raised corporation tax that much. And so he could have said, oh, we've got a calibration we can do here. We can, reduce that enormous tax hike a bit more, maybe not do the health and social care levy that raised national insurance contributions, and still be able to do everything we thought we'd be able to do at this stage. But he chose not to do that. And so he chose instead to continue down a path with much greater government spending. So in a sense, it was the easiest budget any Chancellor has ever had to deliver, because he'd already done the tax raising, and all he had to do was show that debt was going to continue to come down, decent fiscal rule to keep that in check, and spend money on all the things they thought they needed to spend money on. Within which there were some things that business welcomed, but that wasn't enough to offset, the enormity of how the funds were being raised.
And just a quick follow-up for you, Kitty, if you don't mind, just briefly, do you think it was politically clever to do what he did, to have those tax rises baked in, and then on the other hand have these spending rises in the budget? So on one hand, you haven't got the pain of the tax rises being covered in relation to the budget, and on the other, Labour have got very little room for manoeuvre.
Well, yes, in that it was then not seen as a tax raising budget. So in terms of the reaction to last week, it was relatively benign. I'm not sure how much politics there was in the original corporation tax decision, because that looked like a sort of someone has to pay for the pandemic choice. But I think the politics of the health and social care levy, doing it on the first day of term in September with no budget, no finance bill, as fast as possible, forcing it through Parliament, was a political risk, but one that paid off for them.
Mm. And Carl, Jim, you mentioned the relative shortage of business measures that we saw. What did you make of that? Do you think it was a mistake to have very little for businesses to get their teeth into when companies are facing so many challenges at the moment, or was it wise to avoid tinkering? What do you think the kind of businesses that you work with will have thought about it?
Yeah, thanks, Jimmy, and good morning, everyone. I wasn't remotely surprised by the lack of or shortage of business measures. James, I think the government have probably taken the view that they've done enough to support businesses, corporate businesses, whilst we've had COVID. I mean, through furlough, through government support loans, through restrictions on the ability to pursue insolvent companies. I think they've taken the view that they've put enough money into this, and they will now want to revert back to where we were 2 years ago and allow market forces to take their turn. There's no doubt that they've put in a huge amount of money, and I think they just decided to draw a line over it. So I wasn't remotely surprised. I was expecting or I wasn't expecting a continuation of the support measures that they've been bringing in over the last 2 years.
Cassandra, what about you? What did you think? Do you think this budget will have done anything to reassure entrepreneurs at the moment? Because entrepreneurs are facing all sorts of challenges, aren't they? From recovering from the pandemic to inflationary pressures to labour shortages, increased taxes, of course, coming next year. It feels like there's so many headwinds for people trying to grow businesses. Will this budget have done anything to reassure entrepreneurs like you, do you think?
Yeah, headwinds is a word we're using a lot internally at the moment. It's a really tough trading environment. I think 3 key things: uncertainty around staff, as you said, uncertainty on supply chain, and that's a really big problem, and uncertainty on government having the back of the country's risk takers. So on a practical level, bottlenecks across supply and talent is restricting growth. As a food business operating in multiple markets, you can imagine the challenges we're facing. The war for talent is now everywhere. So staff shortages are ripping from haulage to hospitality right across all parts of the economy. And when I speak to friends who run businesses, it's the key thing that's keeping them awake at night. In terms of the budget, businesses will be relieved to see access to foreign talent. I think is going to be easier from April or spring next year. But many who have holes in their business right now are feeling it. But I think the bigger point here, and I hope Kitty and Jimmy in particular agree with me, is that government must also change its attitude to SMEs, because despite making up 99% of the UK's economy, I, for one, have noticed a distinct shift in tone and language for the worse from government since I started my business 10 years ago. So the budget didn't ignore entrepreneurs. There was business rate relief and more support for R&D. But schemes designed to encourage risk-taking, like entrepreneurs relief, have been reduced recently. And I think they need to be really careful of the message they're sending to those thinking of starting a business now or taking their company to the next level, because we're reaching a really pivotal moment where to bounce back and recover, we need more risk-taking and creativity, not less. And so I really think the government needs to go a lot further to acknowledge and really listen to the concerns of those taking those risks. I think there just needs to be much more progressive, tangible policy. And it's less about what was said, but what wasn't said. So I think the country remains a good place to start a business with initiatives like EIS and SEIS, which really promotes access to capital. But if there isn't direct acknowledgement of these challenges, I think entrepreneurs are going to start wondering whether they open their doors for business elsewhere, which I really hope doesn't happen.
Jimmy, have you got any follow-up to that? How do you think the government might react to Cassandra's statement there? Because I don't think any Conservative government wants to be thought of as anti-enterprise, or maybe just less interested in enterprise. Do you think that's fair?
I don't quite agree with everything Cassandra says there, but I do take the point, and I've flipped sides, right? So up till 2 years ago, I was in number 10. I now run a podcast company, Jimmy's Jobs of the Future. We've just taken on the first couple of members of staff, and all the forms that you have to fill out and all the things, it is gosh, I didn't sort of appreciate this when I was in number 10 and so on. So I've kind of flipped sides and see it from both angles. I think there is a challenge of who kind of speaks for business and who does that. And I think there's a real challenge about how we change. We're at a fundamental kind of crossroads, and you can, every budget people say that, and missed opportunities, etc. But it is huge what the moment we've got now. And 10 years ago, the government put a lot of emphasis on starting businesses, Startup Britain campaign. I do think it's slightly different now. I actually think it is a pretty fundamentally fertile ground for people to start a business. And actually, most of it's been quite easy from my side. But that next bit of actually, how do we scale and how do we encourage people to take on that extra member of staff, and the sort of step up or scale up Britain campaign that is needed now. I do think is a fair point on that, because like Cassandra was saying, like a lot of the SEIS and EIS, a lot of these was brought in 10 years ago. You know, what other kind of like flagship proposals now that entrepreneurs can get really excited about to start their businesses?
I think that's a fair point, because it almost seems to me that this Chancellor is kind of definitely more interested in that growth phase rather than the startup phase. And I do think that maybe they leave themselves open to a little bit of criticism around, for example, cancelling the new enterprise allowance, which helps companies off the ground, is slightly positionally challenging, perhaps. Well, Kitty, what's the ID's position on whether this government is doing enough to support SMEs?
We would say not enough. And I think what Jimmy's just put his finger on in terms of what growth feels like when you're a small business gets to the key of it, gets to the heart of it. I think they have a misunderstanding of what the word investment feels like for most businesses. There's been some very welcome changes to the tax system to incentivize investment in plant and machinery, big kit. And lots of talk around how if staff become more expensive, then that will incentivize, shifting to more automation. But most businesses are in the service sector, and most businesses, in the word investment, probably means taking on more people. It might even just be as simple as taking on sales team with better networks, or it might be investing in computer programmers or bringing in more knowledge. But all of this is people-based, and so then when you deliberately make it more costly to employ someone by raising employers' national insurance contribution, and you don't have tax incentives for reskilling and upskilling and investment in human capital, it sometimes does feel like they don't really understand what growth feels like for the sort of real engine room of the economy, which is the smaller companies. And to the point on EIS and SEIS, I mean that should have been expanded, and it can be expanded quite dramatically now that we're outside the EU, actually, to go into different sectors as well. Now there was some regional sort of business angel increased funding and more money regionally through the business, the British Business Bank, which did nod in that direction. So it wasn't all bad, but it doesn't feel like there are entrepreneurs at the heart of government at the moment.
And just to stay with you briefly, Kitty, I wanted to ask about business rates, because it feels like that probably was the single biggest measure that we got that was relevant to businesses. If we could track back a couple of years, I seem to remember being promised that we were going to get fundamental reform of business rates to try and solve this inequality between the high street and online. Now, we did see some quite significant giveaways, didn't we? And probably some quite welcome rule changes as well around encouraging investment, as you just alluded to. Was that enough, do you think?
Well, it wasn't fundamental reform, and that's what was in the Conservative Party manifesto. And there's been a really comprehensive sort of review of the system that everybody's contributed to that's lasted some time, and that was too difficult, I think. So that's not to say that the changes aren't welcome, and in particular reliefs for smaller businesses and in the hospitality sector that's had a particularly difficult time, absolutely great. And the one thing that just felt ridiculous in today's day and age has been improved, which is if you invest in improving the carbon footprint of your building, that then raises the value and you get taxed more. So it's a disincentive, to get all those sort of good ventilation systems, solar panels and so on, and that's been improved. So that is great. But fundamentally, business rates is a really old-fashioned way of taxing, and it doesn't feel very 21st century because it takes no account whatsoever of people's online sales window, and the opportunity to address that from a blank piece of paper has been missed. You wouldn't want to be starting from here, is the conclusion.
Jimmy, what do you think the government can do on this? Business rates is, I think, a real big problem for them, because it's on one hand it's sort of fundamentally outdated, but on the other hand it's a tax that brings in a hell of a lot of money. I forget it's either the third or fourth biggest revenue raiser for the public finances. I forget which, but it's right up there, and also it's easy to collect and it's hard to avoid. So it's got a lot of the kind of qualities you want, and if you're sitting there in the Treasury. But as Kitty's identified, it does need reform. How is the government going to go about this?
Well, look, I think it's really difficult, and it's tried to do it a few times. And it is also the policy, it is the business tax policy that every politician understands, because every politician has a high street in their constituency and gets lobbied by them. So it's quite sort of, politically, it is very understood as well. Because actually, when it comes to a lot of business taxation, actually they're not that particularly well understood at a kind of broad parliamentary level. So that's also another appeal of it as well, another appeal and danger of it. And so, I mean, I think, look, you're at a point where you're going to have enormous shifts on lots of policies, going back to the point about taking people on and so on. Like, it's far easier to take contractors on and all this side of things. And that's something the Treasury's been looking at a while as well. And you're going to have a whole new pattern of work post the pandemic for white collar workers like Carl and I, literally embodying it here. And I think that has got to be a way of trying to work out a new system, because also I don't think you need to pay people as much for their kind of 37.5 hours. Like, all of that, there's so many fundamental changes that's happening in the economy. Like, the government is going to need to assess all of it properly and work out how it can kind of raise money. And also, the economy is so much more globalized as well. Just to make the obvious point is, I think you look at it and the Treasury will want to bring in an online sales tax of some description, but how do you make sure that you capture Amazon within that?
Well, they just decided not to. Through the OECD process, they've committed to not introducing digital sales taxes, and in fact to reducing the ones that already exist, and that's a global deal done with Amazon, in return for which there'll be a more repatriation of sort of Amazon's profits and other similar companies. So this is really, really difficult.
Oh yeah, there was a line in the budget that they will have an online sales tax consultation at some stage, but again, consultation.
It just,
okay.
This issue just keeps getting kicked down the road endlessly, doesn't it, at the moment? And we're getting some good questions come in on the Q&A, so thank you very much everyone who's done that, and I'm going to get to those in a moment. I just wanted to ask one final question on the budget, so direct budget side of things for now, if that's okay, and it's to each of you. Could I just ask each of you what you think one big miss maybe was the budget? What wasn't in the budget that you would have liked to have seen? Carl, why don't we start with you?
I think in terms of the budget, I think Jimmy hit the nail on the head, by the way, that I think they got the bad news over and done with a couple of months ago. Certainly in terms of the tax increases, corporation tax. One big thing that I was expecting, I think a number of my colleagues were expecting in terms of tax, was an increase in capital gains tax. That's been talked about probably for the last 2 years, would impact a relatively low number of people. And I think entrepreneurs around the UK were expecting that. In terms of our own business, activity in terms of company sales have been very high over the last 6-9 months, in an expectation that capital gains tax would increase. But yet again, no increase at all. I think that's probably a political move rather than anything else. So that was a miss for me.
Cassandra, how about you? Anything you would have liked to have seen in the budget that you didn't?
Well, it was covered, but I just don't think they went far enough. So I want to talk about sustainability. We've got COP coming up, and sadly, being green often comes at a premium due to smaller volumes or demand, and that's just the way the market works. And as we've discussed, the current trading environment is the toughest it's been for decades for many. And so some companies can afford to give sustainability the resource and prioritization that it needs. I don't know a single entrepreneur that doesn't have the planet at the top of their agenda, but it is going to be tougher for businesses to do the better or the right thing when they are facing business critical events day in, day out across, as we said, supply chain, staff shortages. And so there were things like, I think, tax release for solar panels and things like that. But I think the government should have gone a lot further to support businesses to make those greener, more sustainable choices, because we just can't afford to let sustainability fall out of businesses' price range. And that is, I think the government didn't have a clear enough sensibility of that's how sustainable choices operate within a business framework.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. And I think I saw some research recently that small and medium-sized companies represent about half of carbon emissions. So you're going to have to get them on board if you want to tackle this issue. But we didn't see very much on that, did we? Jimmy, how about you?
A reflection I have is listening to George Osborne on a podcast recently where he talked about he did 6 budgets as Chancellor, and the ones he regrets are the ones where he didn't really go after fundamental reform enough and just made tweaks. He particularly talks about the 2012 Omnishambles budget. And I do think that they may look back and think in the long course of history, potentially, that this was a bit of a holding pattern budget. As I say, politically, that's very astute, build up a bit of capital, allowing you to go into the budget close to the election with more giveaways. It makes a lot of sense, but I do think there are so many fundamental issues that we've talked about in this kind of almost new Renaissance era that we're living in that need to be taxed, and there wasn't much on that at all.
And finally, Kitty?
Well, we had a very particular idea, which is that the so-called super deduction that encourages investment in plant and machinery should apply to human capital as well. And that would have helped us sort of create an economy that is fit for purpose as we leave the EU, and there was nothing.
Thank you very much. I'm going to turn to a couple of questions now from the Q&A. So thank you to everyone who's got involved. The first one is from Paul Wagstaff. Hi, Paul. It's a question for you, Carl. What's your view on the government getting back all the emergency loans that they have guaranteed? Paul's particularly referring to bounce back loans. He says he has a number of clients that will struggle to repay so soon as not yet got going after lockdown, even though there was a 6-month extension on offer. Are you seeing a lot of distress in relation to companies with emergency loans in the companies that you're advising?
That's a good question, and it's been reasonably well publicised. I mean, I think there's an expectation that a very significant percentage of those government loans, whether they're C bills or B bills, will never be repaid.
Yeah.
And I think the government expect that to happen. I think that there will also be extensions in terms of the repayment periods to allow businesses to recover over a longer period of time. I think there's also, being slightly cynical, a number of businesses who've taken these loans over the last 18 months who will inevitably fail, and all that loans have done is just enable those businesses to dribble on for another 6 to 9 months. So yeah, we are expecting a significant proportion of those loans to be effectively written off.
It's from the data that I think the British Business Bank has looked at so far, the write-offs are not quite as bad as maybe some of those doomsday scenarios you remember we saw.
But it's very early. It's very early days, James.
Yeah, so I was just about to say it's going to be very interesting to see how this washes out next year, because it's a case of you ain't seen nothing yet, probably, isn't it?
That's absolutely right. Absolutely right.
And one for you, I think, Kitty. Steve Ratcliffe. Hi, Steve. Steve says the OBR forecast showed a substantial spike in inflation over the next 3 years. And I think all of us can feel the supply chain issues caused by both the pandemic and Brexit make that seem likely. If the major tool to keep inflation under control is still an increase in interest rates, which is also forecast by the OBR, what does the panel feel is the likely effect on the economy and on consumers directly? What do you think, Kitty?
Well, I mean, this is the question, and the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England is meeting later this week. And on the one hand, they don't want to do anything because they don't know how the end of furlough is going to affect all the staff shortages, because it may be that more people appear and things alleviate and there's more capacity in the economy to sort of soak some of this up. Or it may be that inflation expectations and what that means for wage demands and pay rises and prices in the shops have now become embedded in the system, in which case it becomes very urgent to change the mood around inflation. And even the fact that these questions are now being asked makes me personally think we probably need to do the latter. So there needs to be some movement quite soon so that this doesn't become kind of baked in. But then, of course, that has an effect on growth. But if we're seeing overheating, that's exactly what the Bank of England is for.
Jimmy, do you have any thoughts on how this can be handled politically? Because, you know, if these inflation forecasts are actually worse than feared, then Rishi presumably is going to have to revisit a lot of this stuff next year and have some pretty difficult choices to make.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think that politically, sometimes we can live with quite short memories, actually, and particularly a minor point of the sort of turnover of politicians that we have had since 2010, when inflation was last an issue, has actually almost kind of forgotten about what a pressure that can be on it. And we've kind of got used to a bit of a kind of new economic paradigm of low inflation, low interest rates, etc., despite actually quite turbulent economic times. You know, you've had the financial crash, you've had Brexit, and you've had the pandemic, and you know, almost three black swan-esque events. And actually, sometimes you can look at it and think, well, the economy hasn't like sort of dramatically kind of reacted to any of those things. And I do think that is kind of, there's a danger of complacency there and forgetting the things that could happen and so on. So yeah, I think it's a huge thing that that they'll be very aware of, and they will need a potential plan for at some stage.
Yeah, thank you. And just to go back, I suppose, to the theme that was brought up by the question on bounce backs, we had a pre-submitted question for you, Carl, that I think is worth bringing in at this point. The question was, are you expecting a tsunami or trickle of insolvencies? Are you providing a lot of board advisory advice on options presently to businesses running out of cash? I'm very interested to hear your answer to this as well, because, you know, if you think back to the last financial crisis, a lot of people were expecting a big spike in insolvencies for obvious reasons. And of course, that never happened. And we had the sort of zombie business phenomenon, didn't we? Do you think finally we're now going to see a big trend towards insolvencies and you know, people like you and lots of people on this call being very busy?
You won't believe the number of times I've been asked that question over the last 18 months to 2 years. And I sort of gave up forecasting following the last crash in 2008, 2009, where I think within the restructuring profession, we were all expecting a massive increase in projects, and it never happened. So, you know, what's happened over the last 18 months, we've obviously had the government support measures, which we've talked about previously, and that's had clearly an impact upon the level of insolvencies, and the levels have been significantly down on pre-COVID stats. What we've seen actually over the last couple of months is coming back to pre-COVID levels, so that the insolvency statistics, i.e. businesses going into some form of insolvency in August and September of this year, are back to roughly where we were in August and September in 2019. No higher, they're about the same level. I've yet to see the October stats, which I think will be out probably within the next week or so. So my expectation, and it's changed actually, I think as a profession we were expecting, to use your expression, a tsunami. I don't think we will see a tsunami. I think there will be, towards the back end of this calendar year and going into early 2022, a spike, and that spike will happen because of the no longer doing furlough, and obviously the fact that the government restrictions on the ability to pursue through winding up petitions is no longer relevant. So enforcement procedures are now back in play. I think that will take 2 or 3 months to come through, and I do think we'll see a spike in levels of insolvencies going higher than pre-COVID levels. But I think going further into 2022, my expectation is we'll be back to where we were pre-COVID. I don't see it going on forever.
Interesting. We had a comment from Arthur Howard that I just wanted to bring in because I thought it was interesting. Hi, Arthur. Arthur says, so much for the lessening of red tape, which is always a message that, of course, governments are keen to get across. And Arthur says, if anything, we are drowning in new rules and red tape at this present time. And I'm so fed up that after many years, I'm seriously thinking of selling my practice. Now, presumably, Arthur is a professional, so some of those rules might be specific to his industry. But I wanted to ask you, Cassandra, if you had any sort of empathy with that statement, really. Do you think that the red tape burden has gone up in the period that you've been running your business? Has it got harder to run your business from a sort of, administrative point of view?
Yeah, well, Arthur, I hope you don't have to close down your practice. Thankfully, I have an area of my business that deals with a lot of that red tape, so it's not me personally dealing with it. What I would say is, we used things like the Sybil's loan, and just trying to figure that out and get access to it was incredibly challenging. We had sort of our best minds in the business, on some of that access, and it is very challenging and complicated. So yeah, I can't answer kind of more broadly how that's feeling.
Kitty, do you have any thoughts on this? Because we haven't actually even mentioned Brexit yet, have we? Which is kind of extraordinary because we're sort of 40 minutes in, and we've done the same as Rishi Sunak, where we've managed to completely avoid it. But Brexit will have caused, of course, new red tape for people, and some of that, if you've got lots of imports going on, some of that's going to get harder next year when the import controls come in. Do you think businesses are struggling with an increased administrative burden, or is it just further down the pecking order when you've got all these other headwinds that we've mentioned already on the call to consider as well?
We survey our Institute of Directors members monthly, and it's very clear coming through that those that trade with the EU are finding it very, very challenging indeed, and that's taking up a lot of time and resources. And in particular, it's supposed to be tariff-free access in many cases, but you have to sort of prove the rules of origin of all of your supply chain, which in itself is a hugely cumbersome task for some businesses, such that sometimes it's easier just to pay the tax, which has is exactly the opposite from what the government's been telling us. So I mean, yes, this is always an issue. There's a sort of semantic point though that bureaucracy and red tape are very negative, difficult words, and obviously we want to reduce it as much as possible. But you immediately have to get into the detail, as that trading example shows, to actually work out what the issue is and how you deal with it. So yeah, we're continually monitoring this. There are other big issues as well for business. I mean, the effect dealing with the coronavirus and general sort of economic uncertainty and fear of cost rises and inflation is probably higher up the list at the moment for our firms, just to give you a sense of priorities there. But it's still very much a problem.
James, I'm sorry. I would echo the sentiments of the question. I mean, I'm an entrepreneur. I set my own business up 9-10 years ago, and good luck with yours, Jimmy, by the way. And even over a period of that short period of time, the bureaucracy and the red tape has got worse and worse. So if there's one thing that, I mean, it's a recurring theme, and it's been around forever and a day, red tape and bureaucracy. But there's one thing that the government could do is try and make it easier certainly for the aspiring entrepreneur. Goes back to Cassandra's point, I think, earlier on. How can we support younger businesses? We'll try and cut down or streamline the red tape and the bureaucracy, because it takes up a huge amount of time. It's often not relevant for many smaller businesses.
A question from Shirish, and this I had this question on my list to ask as well. So thank you for the reminder, Shirish. And Shirish says that all current indications, particularly with supply chains, are for increased pressure on inflation. And Shirish says that a forecast of a peak at around 5% is looking very optimistic. But it's just staying with you for a moment, Carl. In the businesses that you're advising, how do you sort of see them trying to strike this balance between rising costs, the ability to pass those on to customers without undermining demand? What kind of things are your clients trying to do to handle this problem?
I mean, it's a real problem, and there is no simple answer to it. I think rising costs is that they're here to stay. I mean, all I would say is that the smart entrepreneur will be on top of their own margins and understand their margins. They'll be on top of business efficiencies to make sure they can still run effectively and efficiently, despite the fact that costs are rising. They will be on top of their customers, their clients, because it's a competitive world, and they need to be creative. I mean, there's no magic wand, sadly, to this. But for the smart entrepreneur, they will get through it. For those entrepreneurs or those businesses who ignore it, they'll inevitably struggle, and many will go under. So yeah, look, I mean, there is no magic wand, sadly, but it's just a question of keeping on top of your business.
And Kitty,
sorry,
Cassandra, go on.
No, I was going to add, I just think I'd add to what Carl's saying is that, yes, and, you know, I speak to a lot of small businesses that are really in their kind of their you know, first 1 or 2 years, and they're on top of their margins. They're looking across their supply chain for those opportunities to in any way protect their margin. But right now, with the real headwinds, again, that word that we're facing across supply chain and talent, it is untenable for some businesses. It really is, and it's more than sort of being creative and being on top of it. It's really sort of thinking about, we are now backed into a corner, and I really worry for some small businesses, and because they are really at sort of a crunch point with this particular issue.
Yeah, and Kitty, how long do you think this might last? I know that's a difficult question, but the context, I guess, is that the Bank of England and government view seems to be an optimistic one, in the sense that we're going to have quite a serious problem with this for, you know, maybe a year or two, but then it should just wash through and things will return back to a more normal kind of, you know, slightly towards 2% target inflationary period. Do you agree with that? Do you think this is a short-term problem that's a symptom of the, you know, the overheating that's come as we recover from the pandemic, or do you think inflation could be here to stay?
That's a very good question. The difference between the two is what businesses are planning for. So inflation expectations become self-fulfilling. So if we all start factoring in 5%, then obviously we'll allow 5% pay rises, and so therefore prices in the shops can go up by 5% and so on, and it becomes built in. I think the way I've thought about this throughout is that with monetary policy so loose and interest rates currently at their lowest level ever, not just in our lifetimes, but ever, 0.1%, I'm fairly optimistic about the role of the ability of policy to do something. And we have, thank goodness, an independent Bank of England whose job is to get inflation at 2% in the medium term. Now, they may not always get it right. That's a technocratic decision, but they have a huge amount of room for manoeuvre to you know, they have the policy tools to be able to do this. So that's why I wouldn't start thinking that this is going to accelerate and we're going to be on 10% for 3 years or anything like that. But the adjustment and road to that might feel a bit bumpy along the way. But the other point is that, you know, why is this happening? And it does seem plausible that there is a disconnect between supply and demand. We're shifting to some kind of new equilibrium, and we don't quite know where that is. We've got lots of variables at play, and we can point to where those are, whether it's international shipping or semiconductor issues, or coming out of COVID, or Brexit, or HGV drivers. And, you know, we can point to all of them. And therefore, there's no reason to think that it won't adjust. But supply side adjustment takes time and feels difficult.
I think the other interesting thing here is that, you know, none of us have got much experience of being in an inflationary environment, unless you'd have to be quite old to really remember a big inflationary environment, wouldn't you?
I know, and you know, I instantly reveal my age by saying I remember when it was 10% in the late 80s, and actually, interestingly, my mind keeps going back to that, because that's what we're frightened of, and I think there's lots of reasons to be confident that we won't be there. Famous last words, but that's not to say it's not a short-term issue. And
there's lots, as you said, I think it's very interesting how a lot of it comes down to perception and how businesses and consumers think prices are going to change. I listened to a fascinating podcast a while back from where they spoke to a now very elderly Paul Volcker, who'd been trying to get inflation under control in the US in, I think, the late 70s and 1980, and he did all sorts of things to try and get it under control. And his conclusion in this podcast as to what had worked was people thought prices would stop going up. So I thought.
That's absolutely it. So the Bank of England measures inflation expectations. That is far more important than actual inflation.
Exactly. So moving on, Anup, hi. Anup, again, this was one that I was going to come to, so thanks very much for the reminder. Anup wanted to know if the panel had any views on COP26 and climate change and its impact on business. Cassandra, you mentioned this earlier, didn't you? And we were talking about the fact that SMEs represent about half of private sector emissions. But given all the other things we've been talking about on this call, all the things businesses have got on their plate at the moment, do you think there's anything that could be done to help businesses or encourage businesses like yours to do more to reduce their emissions? I know it's already a big thing for your company, but how do we get more companies to think about this?
Yeah, I mean, quite honestly, I really believe that the drive for more sustainable business practices lies actually at the very heart of the startup and SME sector. It's, where the B Corp movement, of which Proper is one, emerged from, and where a lot of green tech and innovation come from. But just sort of going back to my earlier point, I really do worry about how it's going to be increasingly tougher for businesses to make those choices, given the challenges they're facing. And so just the government really needs to do much more to have more tax reliefs for businesses adopting greener technologies and things like that. And I think more pressure needs to be on the biggest companies to bring down that green premium. That's probably, given the kind of how the market works, that's where the pressure really needs to be focused to make it a more accessible choice.
We were talking earlier about, weren't we, about things that were missing from the budget. Jimmy, were you surprised that there wasn't more actually on green incentives and encouraging businesses to reduce their emissions, given the proximity to COP26? And secondly, what kind of things might the government look at in future to try and get businesses to do more to reduce their carbon footprint?
Yeah, well, I see on one of the questions, Sean Taylor saying, with Rishi's push to a green economy. I'm not sure how much Rishi's pushing it compared to the Prime Minister, actually. And I do think there is a bit of a disconnect there with the budget, and as has been outlined, some of the things around APD changes and so on. But it's a global issue, right? You can bang on about the government like doing all of it once. UK makes up 1% of it. China 30%, not even at the table. So that is a huge kind of issue that needs to be like lent on in terms of foreign policy, etc. So I think the government can do certain things with it. And Cassandra's so outraged by my point, she seems to have left the conversation. But I think it's business. I think there is a lot happening in business and entrepreneurship, and people wanting to get there on its way. I'm not sure like how much of this is on government to do, because, and I think that was very interesting that we haven't really touched on much. Rishi's points towards the end about, we're looking at government for a heck of a lot, and we have done for the last 2 years. That is fine. That is what was needed at a moment of national and global crisis. But actually, there are fundamentally, whose responsibility are things. And I think when it comes to sustainability and green issues, to Cassandra's point around the green premium, I think that's really important.
Carl, do you
disagree?
Well, let's bring you in then, Kitty.
I'll try and be quick. I think, well, certainly our members, which are the sort of SME kind of engines of growth, they care about sustainability, they want to do the right thing, they don't know how to do it, and they want government to tell them. So I think this is a really, really good example of where there is a role for government. Just simple stuff like, here's your toolkit, here's your metrics, this is what we expect. And for the biggest companies, you can do it through the corporate governance framework, and that is improving. But we need to work out how to do it for the smaller companies so that they don't feel that they're the bad guys when they simply don't know what it is that government is expecting them to do.
I also wonder if maybe we might end up eventually seeing a bit like we've got, we understand about government guarantee schemes now and everything because of the pandemic, might we see the state provide guarantee schemes for people to invest in, you know, green infrastructure in their businesses, for example, whether that will be a thing? I know that's something that the banking industry is talking to the government about. So that's perhaps another example of how the state might step in. Is that something that the IOD has spoken to the government about, Kitty?
Certainly something we would support, but I think the point is broader in that for every business is different. Yeah, so for some it might be investment in, you know, specifically green technologies. For others it might just simply be, well, how do I measure my carbon impact, and is there a standardized way of doing that, and how much does it cost, and who's going to tell me, and how do I tick this box that I really want to tick, and not feel that, you know, I'm doing the wrong thing.
We've spoken a fair bit about inflation, so I wanted to move on to one of the other big challenges that companies are facing, which Cassandra alluded to earlier, which is, of course, staffing shortages. John asks, hi John. John says, how do the panel see the staffing shortage issues develop over the next few years? Is apprenticeship funding that we saw in the budget enough of a response to tackle this? Why don't we stay with you briefly, Kitty, because I know you've got thoughts on this.
Sorry, say that again. You lost me slightly there. Sorry, it's my technology.
No, it's okay. John was basically asking whether the measures on apprenticeship funding and skills training will be enough to tackle the significant staffing issues that companies have got.
Yes, apologies for that. I think it's great as far as it goes, but it seems to be quite entry level. So skills boot camps to fill shortage skills, great, but it's aimed at younger people. Greater investment in higher education and further education, great, but again, it's for people coming into the labour market. So all of that is good as far as it goes. What sort of feels missing is an understanding of how the kind of adult workforce needs to be enabled to upskill and reskill in order to fill the shortages that we're expecting in the future. There seems to be a sort of lack of mapping of that, and the previous government disbanded an organisation called the UK Commission on Employment and Skills that existed specifically to look at these issues, and sector skills councils as well, specifically supposed to be looking at the training and certified qualifications across different parts of the economy. They've basically had all their funding taken away. There are some local learning and skills partnerships in local areas, but there doesn't seem to be a holistic view of this. And so it, by definition, can only solve part of the problem.
Jimmy, I must bring you in here because, you know, Jimmy's jobs of the future. You must be the world's expert on this, right? So yeah, what's your view?
Yeah, asking entrepreneurs is my expert on it. But I think it's, I mean, like, just to say, like, data science and software engineering, if people can do that, or people's kids can do that, like, get them to do it, because that is the two that come up all of the time. And particularly, I think data science is quite, you know, if you're good at maths, you're probably going to be good at data science. Software engineering is a bit more complicated. And I think that comes to the nub of the problem with a lot of it. It's quite difficult to recognize your own skill set at times. And that's a real challenge for how we kind of retrain people going forward on it. I mean, the skills of the future is a fascinating topic, which obviously now I'm dedicating a lot to it. One of the things I've been particularly struck by in the podcast over the last few months is that a lot of the skills that we're looking at for the future are not fundamental. You know, business doesn't change that much. You know, it's, can you create a product that people want to buy for more than you can make it for? And, you know, how do you market that and so on? All the tools are different. That is the challenge, right? Is how do you use all the different tools, be it social media, etc. I mean, if people want to check out one episode of the podcast, check out the Ben Francis one of Gymshark, who's built 800 people now in the West Midlands, is going to be hiring a lot more. Took me through all the job titles. I don't recognize most of them, right? And I'm not that old despite the beard, etc. And I find it amazing. I also find it quite frightening for how people can know whether they understand these. And I take Kitty's point that I think a lot of it, what the government is doing at the moment, is kind of quite short term, etc. But I think we should be really excited about what's coming down the track when it comes to technological changes and so on in this space, because I think as I've said a few times before, but the kind of renaissance period that we're living through causes enormous disruption whilst we're going through it. But at the end of it, everyone has a lot more fulfilling jobs, longer life expectancy, all of these things. But going through it can be very difficult for people in terms of that dislocation of what happens.
And of course, a big challenge for businesses as well to manage that transition. Carl, to what extent do you see businesses trying to, the kind of companies you're advising, do you see them having, tried to invest in the skills of the future versus trying to, plug the short-term gaps that they're feeling at the moment?
That's a real challenge, James, isn't it? I mean, the bottom line is certainly, again, for those smaller distressed businesses, they need to make the numbers add up, and a lot of these sort of soft, I can call them soft opportunities, go by the wayside, which is a real shame. I mean, look, we're a people business. The Quantuma business employs over 350 people, and we're constantly thinking of ways in which we can attract, develop, train, etc. It's absolutely critical. It's a very different world now to the world I started in professional services, sadly, over 30 years ago. But it's. I mean, I echo everything that Jimmy said.
And I think there's a lot of discussion around attracting talent and access to talent, which is where the kind of vast bulk of the problem lies. But actually, I think talent retention is a huge problem that particularly fast growth businesses are facing. So companies are experiencing attrition at levels never seen before. And I think there was a recent article in the FT about the Great Resignation. I think the past 2 years have really prompted people to question things. And it's a much more nuanced problem, but I think the onus is now on businesses to really evaluate how they continue to be relevant, flexible, kind of values-led, whatever it may be, so it chimes with the values of potential talent and employees. But yeah, that's a really big part of the problem as well, is that retention piece.
Cassandra, could I just ask you, in your business, how tricky is it to get the people that you need to grow at the rate that you want to grow at the moment?
It's really tough to find talent quick enough, but also it's a very competitive market, and I'm really proud of our our retention levels, but we have to go incredibly far to ensure that at every part of the employee journey we are really working hard to kind of work on that retention and attraction piece, be it through shareholding, flexible working, promoting kind of a healthy mental wellness space. On every single metric now, you really do need to deliver to retain and attract the best talent.
I noticed that we're almost out of time, so I just wanted to quickly thank you all for taking part in the panel, and for everyone who's listened in and submitted excellent questions as well. Thank you. I'd like to just wrap up though by asking one final question for each of you. And given we've spoken so much about all the challenges that businesses are facing, and we've given Rishi a little bit of grief as well about what was missing from the budget and things like that, why don't we finish with one thing that each of you is feeling optimistic about for the future? Who am I going to put on the spot first? Well, I'll go for you, Kitty. Apologies.
I am feeling optimistic about the labour market. I know it's difficult for firms with skills shortages, but compared to where we were this time last year, where we thought unemployment would be 10%, 11%, and it's going to be, I think, under half that, I think we could have been in a much worse situation.
Carl?
I mean, the one thing that came out of the budget, whilst I think politically driven, I think is the level of investment the government are committing to. I mean, I don't think I heard the word austerity once during his budget speech. And if it was mentioned, it was to say we're doing quite the opposite. So again, whilst politically driven and they're sort of levelling up type thing, I'm sure it's to make sure they continue to win those seats in the Midlands and the Northwest that they were successful in doing the last election. So that's pleasing. I mean, and then the investment they're planning in terms of transport, etc. So that was a plus for me.
And Jimmy?
I think I agree with Kitty, and the unemployment challenges. I started the podcast a year ago, partly because I thought there was going to be a massive surge. Now I'm focusing on, the job shortages that we've got. I mean, that is quite a turnaround from what we were kind of expecting. Also, the other thing, setting up my own business and so on, is costs are low, right? Like, you can do an awful lot now, like on pretty small things, on pretty small budgets, to get things going and test new ideas and creativity, to what Cassandra was talking about at the beginning. It's far cheaper than it was 10 years ago.
Yeah, fantastic. And finally, Cassandra.
Yeah, I mean, I think Carl and Jimmy both touched on this. It's a philosophical point that, in times of downturn and struggle, there is opportunity, and actually some of the best ideas and the biggest companies are born out of this. So, Uber, Slack, Airbnb are all born out of these kind of economically challenging times. And so I remain optimistic because of the creativity of people.
Excellent. Well, thank you all so much for your time. Really enjoyed it. And thank you everyone who tuned in. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.